The Mandalorian is back, and with it, we have more insights into the Star Wars universe to discuss. Today's episode saw Din Djarin, our friendly neighborhood Mandalorian, journey to Tatooine in search of more of his kind. To nobody's surprise, his stop there turned into more of a detour as he got involved with local affairs, and ultimately teamed up with a small town and the Sand People to kill a krayt dragon. In doing so, he gave the audience a glimpse of something we hadn't seen much of before, the kinder side of the Tusken Raiders. Contrary to what some other Star Wars media might have led us to expect, the Tuskens weren't monsters, and in this video, we're going to be talking about how the Tusken Raiders weren't as bad as you might have thought.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
The Sand People, or the Gorphers, as some archaeologists learned to call them, had lived in the deserts of Tatooine for many thousands of years. But as the legends kept by their storytellers told, the planet had not always been desert. Once, it had been lush and full of life, and their ancestors, the Kumumga, had built a mighty civilization there that had dared to touch the stars. As punishment for this arrogance, their ancestors had been cast down, conquered, and enslaved by the ancient builders, who stripped the planet of technology and life. Now, we've already gone into detail about the conflict between the Kumumga and their Rakatan overlords in a past video, so we're not going to dwell on it too much in this one. What matters today is how that story ended. The builders glassed Tatooine, and over time, that glass was ground down into sand, shaping the planet into the desert we all know and some of us love. The descendants of the Kumumga who had hid underground during the bombardment became the Jawas and the Gorphers, splitting up into tribes that quarreled over Tatooine's now scarce resources. The Sand People called that period of their history the Long Walk, a time in which they came to terms with themselves and the changes their planet had undergone. They became nomadic people, traveling across the deserts in search of water, which they typically found in caves deep in the planet's canyons. In time, they started to use banthas as beasts of burden, and over millennia, the woolly creatures became sacred to them. They either domesticated or hunted all other animals that could be found on Tatooine, with the exception of the planet's most fearsome predators, the krayt dragons. From early on, the Gorphers learned to fear the krayt dragons, and by the time of the Galactic Civil War, even an imitation of their hunting calls was enough to terrify Sand People. Those that were able to slay the massive lizards and retrieve their pearls were hailed as the greatest of warriors, worthy of leading their tribes. But it wasn't long before the balance of life on Tatooine was disrupted. About 4,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, alien colonists sponsored by Zerka Corporation settled on Tatooine, building a settlement at Anchorhead and laying claim to Gorpha lands and water sources. Even worse, they had come to Tatooine for mining purposes and set off into the deserts aboard massive sand crawlers, tearing up the sands with iron shovels. Hunters affiliated with the Anchorhead colony poured into the Dune Sea, killing large numbers of wild raid and banthas for profit. All told, the outsiders completely upended the Gorphers' way of life. In response, the Gorphers were forced to adapt once more, becoming the Sand People. They had been territorial and aggressive before, as their long history of preying on the Jawas showed, but they hadn't been barbaric or overly prone to violence. Zerka, however, forced their hand. The settlers had stolen their water, killed their beast, and desecrated the deserts with their machines and their filthy footsteps. Furthermore, they were an affront to everything the Gorphers held sacred. In the millennia since the glassing of Tatooine, the Gorphers had come to believe that the destruction of their world and civilization was punishment for the arrogance of their ancestors. The Kumumga had dared to raise themselves above the land, to separate themselves from it instead of living in harmony with it. They sought to subjugate Tatooine with machines, and in time they even tried to touch the stars. The Gorphers had learned from these ancient sins. They abhorred technology that wasn't essential to their daily lives, and above all, they respected the land and lived in harmony with it. Tatooine was much reduced from what it had once been, and they believed that they should be grateful for what they had left. When humans came to Tatooine, everything they did reminded the Gorphers of the sins of their ancestors. They had no respect for the land. They tore it apart with their sand crawlers and walked it with an arrogance and sense of entitlement that the Gorphers detested. Their reliance on machines and their uncanny resemblance to the ancient Kumamga just added insult to injury. To the Gorphers, there was only one response that was proportional to the perceived evils of the outsiders: war. The Sand People began launching raids on Zerka's sand crawlers and eventually on their settlements. The outsiders responded in turn, destroying encampments and killing whole tribes. But this did nothing to cow the Sand People as Zerka had hoped. Instead, it only provoked them further. The Sand People began stealing technology in their raids, both to help accommodate for the changes in their lifestyles and to give them a better chance in combat. In particular, they were prone to stealing moisture vaporators, as Zerka was stealing or destroying their old sources of water. They also derived a sort of bitter satisfaction from using the outsiders' own weapons to blast them to pieces. The Sand People were eventually successful in driving Zerka off, and Tatooine was abandoned by the outside galaxy for a long time. But 600 years before the Battle of Yavin, the planet had been settled by humans once more, this time more extensively. This new wave of settlers wasn't as blasphemous as Zerka had been, so the Sand People gave them the benefit of the doubt at first. They even came to trust one of the outsiders, a rogue named Alcara, who had come from one of the colonies to study the Sand People. But 550 years before the Battle of Yavin, Alcara betrayed a tribe of Sand People that helped him win a battle, killing the whole tribe, adults and children all. This, it is believed, sparked the more recent blood feud between the Sand People and the outsiders. This time, the vicious cycle of raids and retaliation set in permanently. The settlers would trespass on the Sand People's lands and tear up the desert. The Sand People would raid their settlements in response. The settlers would launch a counterattack, and so on. The settlers came to fear and hate the Sand People just as much as the Sand People feared and hated them. They saw them as vicious, inhuman savages, especially in light of their habit of preying on moisture farms. One of the most notorious battles between the Sand People and the settlers was launched against Fort Tusken, an outpost north of the city of Bestine in 100 BBY. Fort Tusken had been built to protect Bestine against the Sand People, but its builders had vastly underestimated their opponents. The Sand People utterly destroyed Fort Tusken, earning them their more formal species name, the Tusken Raiders. To the settlers of Tatooine, the Tuskens were little more than beasts, monsters that hated them for seemingly no reason. They were merciless in their campaigns against the settlers and prone to kidnapping and torturing innocent people, as shown in the case of Shmi Skywalker. This often led to the settlers to be brutal in return, as shown by Anakin Skywalker's great slaughter of not just the men, but the women and children too. Anakin's massacre of the Tuskens is depicted as a step toward the dark side and Attack of the Clones, but from the perspective of the settlers, it was perfectly reasonable and something most of them would see as justified. But from the Tusken perspective, the story was quite different. To them, it was the outsiders that were the monsters, the arrogant savages who had no respect for what Tatooine offered them. They disrupted the ecosystem wherever they settled, and they had no respect for the Tuskens or their way of life. When the Tuskens repaid them for their crimes, the outsiders would respond by murdering whole tribes. The Tuskens probably saw their actions as merciful when compared to what these blasphemous outsiders actually deserved. The Tusken Raiders weren't animals. They were perfectly willing to accept and even lend a hand to outsiders that respected them and their traditions. There are many examples of this in both legends and canon. Obviously, we have the example of Din Djarin developing a rapport with the Tuskens and even going so far as to learn their language, as well as the example of the Tusken alliance with the people of Freetown. In Legends, we have the aforementioned example of Alcara, as well as the example of Revan, who, thanks to HK-47's translation abilities, was able to forge an alliance with the Sand People and even earn the respect of their chieftains. The Tuskens even adopted a Jedi named Sharad Het into their culture and raised his son, Ashrad Het, as if he was a Tusken himself. At the end of the day, the Tuskens really acted no different from humans. They got violent, sure, but only when provoked, and if you respected them, they respected you in turn. They weren't evil or bloodthirsty or anything like that. All they wanted was to maintain their way of life and protect their homeworld. Is that so unreasonable? We don't think so. But what do you think? Has this changed your mind about the Tusken Raiders? Or do you, like Anakin Skywalker, hate them as much as the sand they hold dear? Feel free to post your thoughts in the comment section below. And just before you jet off, guys, I hope you're enjoying this new season of The Mandalorian. And if you want to listen to the music we used in this video unobstructed, then make sure you check out our Relax Jack music channel in the description below. If you want access to exclusive content and perks, do check out our Patreon, and if you just want to join our wider Geetsly's community, check out our Discord and Geetsly's gaming network. All of these links are in the description below. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.